This event is the NDC Leadership Compact, and it's focusing on countries that are leading the way on NDC implementation. So we are very pleased to have here with us representatives from countries that have been among the first to take action on their NDCs, and we look forward to hearing their stories as part of this event. Welcome to our online audience. Thank you so much for joining us around the world. Please use hashtag AskUSCenter to ask your questions. Before we get started with the event, before we introduce the panelists, I just want to also welcome all of you and ask that you please save your questions for the end, and we'll have an interactive Q&A session. And I'd like to introduce our opening speaker, Dr. Jonathan Pershing, who is the U.S. Special Envoy for Climate Change. Jonathan.
Thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to see you all here, particularly our panelists, Eric Postel, who's from USAID. It's really, I think, quite an important discussion. If I think about the way we could frame the Paris Agreement and its outcomes, I would put at the heart the nationally determined contributions. They are essentially what the agreement is about. How do we go forward and reduce emissions? And how do we think about doing so in a way that's tailored to each country's national circumstances and their development pathways? And that's a decision that each country takes on its own. Countries submitted their national contributions, the intended ones in the run-up to Paris, and since then they have been working both to implement, but also to move forward and consider how to do so effectively. And we're welcoming here a group of countries who are leading in that domain. We in the United States are working to partner with those who are leaders. Our sense is that if we can demonstrate how to do this effectively, others can follow. And if others follow, we will have a world community which is taking effective and successful action, and that in turn will enable the next round of successful and effective action. Because we recognize that the Paris Agreement on its own was not going to be sufficient. We recognized we were creating a process through which there would be a series of iterations. But in order to get to the second iteration, the first one has to be successful. The first one has to demonstrate both internally as a national and domestic matter that a country can succeed with the agenda that it's set forth for itself. And then it can turn its sights on the next step. And here we have a group of countries taking that first step of agreements, that first step of outcomes. So we're very pleased to announce a new initiative, the launch of the Nationally Determined Contributions Leadership Compact, Leaders Compact, countries that are leading the way to address climate action. And a number of those are here with us, but a number could not make this meeting, and I want to let people know who else is in that leadership group. Who are the other players who are moving forward as rapidly as possible and may provide benchmarks to the rest of the world and ideas and process recommendations for how we could carry things forward. Kenya, Nigeria, Morocco, Malawi, Colombia, Mexico, Peru. These are all countries that have accepted our invitation and are joining us in taking these next steps. We also have group players, and in particular, I'm pleased to recognize ECOWAS, which is a regional partner, is not only representing one nation, but a group of countries thinking how they collectively can move us forward. So what are we trying to do with the compact? Well, the first is that we intend to deepen existing cooperation to enable countries to more successfully pursue their NDC implementation in key priority areas. And second, we'd like to use the agreement, the compact, to showcase these commitments and the impactful actions that countries are taking. If we can get some demonstrators, some first movers, others I think we can find much more effective. Let me talk about a couple of those who are acting already and the kinds of things that they're doing. Morocco, our host, has the potential to provide more than half of its energy needs with renewables and is currently building the largest concentrating solar plant in the world. Clearly a benchmark. Kenya Kenya was named by the United Nations Environment Program as a green finance leader. They are pioneering a pay-as-you-go solar program through a new mobile banking system. Nigeria. Nigeria has made green growth a pillar of their effort to transform their economy and achieve development goals. They made an unconditional commitment for a 20% emission reduction from business as usual, with a particular area of focus in improving energy efficiency by 20%. We're really pleased to have a partnership like this with countries doing this kind of work. We too have set our own goals, a 26 to 28% reduction. President Obama has begun to make good on this pledge. We've seen extended federal tax incentives, and I would note those incentives were passed by a Republican Congress after Paris. This is not something that's going to stop in the context of a change. We note that it's led to a fundamental change in the cost of energy in the United States. Renewable energy becoming much, much more compelling, much lower cost. We've deployed 100 gigawatts of new wind and solar. That's what's expected over the next 5 years. That's anticipated to lower emissions by more than 150 million tons in 2020. These are things that we're already doing. They're not going to change. They're the private sector acting. They're movements because of economics and price. When we entered office in 2008, our emissions were projected to increase pretty much indefinitely. But today, our emissions are about 9% below 2005 levels. And in fact, in 2015, the energy numbers were 12% below 2005 levels. We're making good progress against our goals, and in 2016, we think we are seeing even deeper reductions. In the first 6 months in 2016, CO2 emissions are at their lowest level for more than 25 years. The right stages, the right progress, really helping by spurring a clean energy market. But let's be clear, as these markets grow, so also grows opportunity for investment. Private companies, capital choice. We have an enormous set of opportunities. 6 major renewable investment funds, they yielded last year alone a return on investment of 5.5% to 7%. If those of you who are looking at the current market returns of 1% to 2%, 5.5% to 7% is a very, very good return on investment. Meanwhile, the price has gone down sharply. A recent auction in Mexico, one of the benchmark-setting countries, has prices at about 3.4 cents a kilowatt hour. That's an extraordinary decline. That's competitive with gas. That's much cheaper than most alternative fossil options. Here are the new world dynamics, the new trends in investment that we have to look forward to. And in the meanwhile, we're seeing economic growth. This has not been a process that has yielded a reduction in growth in our economies. We can have clean energy, and we can marry it to GDP increases. The Paris Agreement sets us on a path to significantly reduce emissions and drive down climate change. But the resulting impacts are also there on security. They're also there for stability. They're also preserving the hard-won economic benefits that we've gained. And this bottom-up approach means each country will choose its own actions that fit its own circumstances. And there is a degree of diversity that we look forward to. We're trying to align our own support to support individual countries. There isn't a one-size-fit-all kind of a program. Our goal and the program goal and all of our collective efforts are geared to helping countries move quickly to making substantial progress towards ambitious mitigation targets, as reflected in these national contributions, transforming these political commitments from Paris into very tangible, practical, realizable programs on the ground. Developed and developing countries need new approaches. We have to overcome barriers. We have to learn from each other. We have to take these early innovators and take advantage of their lessons and carry that forward. So let me, with that, turn it over to Eric Postel from USAID, who's going to moderate and engage us in a good conversation, and I look forward to hearing it. Eric?
Thank you, Jonathan. Let me go ahead and introduce our panel now. And also for those of you standing in the audience, there are a few seats up here. Feel free to come up and sit in the front as well, if you're so brave.
Three here.
Moderating our discussion today, we are honored to have Eric Postel, who is the Associate Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. Next to Eric, we have Andrea Guerrero Garcia, who is the Head of Delegation for the Colombian government. Next to Andrea, we have Dr. Harun Wawuri, who is the Head of the Low Emission Development Work in Kenya. And finally, we are honored to have with us Mr. John Yaboa, who is the Coordinator for ECOWAS participation in the compact. And now I'll turn it over to Eric.
Thank you, Ashley. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. One of the main points of this session is for us to have a chance to hear about the different approaches that our panelists and their countries are taking to implementation of NDCs and to learn from each other. So what we thought we would do is I'm going to ask them each to speak for 3 to 5 minutes to give everyone a snapshot, not a complete picture, but a snapshot of 1 or 2 aspects of their approaches or their accomplishments. And then immediately we're going to go from that into questions. I've got a couple for them, but you all will probably have a number and a chance to ask them about the different ways they're approaching this, because there are a lot of differences and it's not one size fits all. So with that, I'd like to start with Andrea, whose work I've seen in a prior role, but working on Colombia's implementation. I've seen the work of she and the government in terms of implementation, and they've done a lot of thinking, and they have some real results. So maybe, Andrea, you could start with talking for 3 to 5 minutes about some of your approaches.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you very much for inviting us to be here. It's a pleasure for us to be here and share the Colombian experience, also learn from other experiences that we have heard are very impressive, so we look forward to that. Very briefly, a very rough sketch of what we've done in Colombia. We started with doing an analysis on the mitigation potential of each of our productive sectors. And of course, red we've always been working on in deforestation and trying to project how that's going to evolve and what we can do about it. But in each productive sector, we did an analysis on where the big emissions were, where they were going to be, and the potential emission reductions. That was on different levels of specificity, and because we had different levels of information. In some sectors we had great information, in others we had huge gaps, but in all of them we tried to, with whatever we had, have that assessment. And then we started to really get the sectors involved and get them to see, out of those opportunities, which ones aligned to the missions that they had been charged with by the government in the National Development Plan. What made sense for them to do? What would reach mitigation, but also other development goals that they had to work towards, and identify those policies, programs, and projects that were aligned. And with that, we built in each sectorial ministry a mitigation action plan. And so we have these documents, they're living documents, they're not finalized, and they get refined often, but we have these guides to tell us where the big potentials are in every sector, and then we have to start looking at what has to be done to be able to move forward in each one. A week before coming here, we had a workshop where every single ministry came in and said, well, this is our plan, and what we've seen are our big barriers to implement it are. And that was a big question. It was very helpful for me to wrap my head around where the big obstacles were. And each sector is different, but 2 things that I want to mention, and I'll close, that were very interesting were, 1, information. Even if we had this first analysis that we did, many of them said we don't know where we don't have the specifics of the information that enable us to design a project or design a program that will reduce emissions. We know that the building sector probably has big emissions. We don't know exactly what activities within the building sector, for example, are producing them. We just don't know. And I would ask somebody in the building sector, well, you pay the bill, don't you pay the guy with the cement truck and then the other guy? He says, no, it's a package many times, and we really just don't know what's in there. so we don't know where to start. So information was mentioned in pretty much every single sector to improve that, and that of course will help us in MRV. And the second one was financial tools and mechanisms. A lot of these programs, policies, and projects that they identified, of course, make sense for them, save the sector money sometimes, make them more efficient, but there's that initial investment that is very difficult. It's difficult to change people's planning from short-term, 5 years, to long-term, to be able to think about the return on that. So a financial mechanism becomes key in many areas to unlock that and just facilitate the transition. So those two were very interesting to hear, and I just want to share that with you.
Thank you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one feature is that after you made all these plans, they went into ministers' actual to-do list that they negotiated with the head of state as to what they would work on. So it wasn't like a standalone ministry had all the objectives. It was dispersed right across the government. Am I remembering that right?
Yes, we have a national climate interinstitutional governance system where ministers sit, and of course we have it at the technical level. And there was where our NDC was approved. And then when we came back with the NDC from Paris, we said, well, how are we going to do this? We decided to divide it. Our NDC has 20% deviation from our emissions projected to 2030 and 30% with help. How are we going to do this? And they decided to do 20% less in each sector. And so they came back with that instruction, and that's what they're trying to get to.
Fantastic. So if you could pass the mic to Harun, and of course Kenya has already, this year they passed this landmark Climate Change Act of 2016, way out in front of a lot of people. So same topic for you, Harun. Could you describe a couple of the main approaches or accomplishments that are already underway in Kenya?
Thank you very much. And thank you for actually alluding to the process of putting in place or operationalizing our Climate Change Act. This year of 2016 has been quite instrumental in our country in terms of setting the right processes, in terms of establishing the necessary policy and legal framework in the country. As mentioned or alluded earlier is that we now have a Climate Change Act. And very important, last month we were able to come up with our climate change framework policy. This was passed by our cabinet, and it will go through the process of the parliament. And this is very key because when you look at the act, it actually has key institutions embedded into it in terms of the high institution will be the National Climate Change Council that actually is being headed by the president. He's the chair of the National Climate Change Council. Then there's the technical arm of the Climate Change Directorate that is actually in terms of providing the technical impetus of implementing the climate change agenda within the country. Very important is that the act also provides for or obligates the national and the county government in terms of their responsibility in dealing with the climate change issues, whereby you realize that there are some functions within the overall act that are devolved, whereby what I mean about the county, I mean the counties are sub-regional government. We have got a two-tier system in Kenya in terms of governance. And then very important is the establishment of the transparency or the monitoring, reporting, and verification mechanism, whereby this is very well articulated within the Act. And then there's also the issue of public participation, which is enshrined in our Constitution. And also, there is the establishment of the Climate Change Fund. The fund is very important in terms of running the climate change agenda in our country, and this will soon be established. And you're working on the mechanism of setting up the fund as anchored within the Act. Very important is the issue of capacity development. Within the Act, it makes it mandatory for mainstreaming climate change in formal and informal curricula. And what we are currently doing, we have started with the high-level institutions within the government, the national government and the sub-regional government. And we are finalizing, we have already done the curriculum for the climate change policy, planning and budgeting process. It's a very comprehensive curriculum that will be integrated within the training courses at the Kenya School of Government as an institution. So we are now finalizing the training manual that will be used for the training. Yep.
Thank you, Harun. Very interesting. And of course, this is where the variations come in, because with the devolution, what happens in the counties and things is as important as what happens in the federal government. So thank you for describing that and some of the other activities. John, of course, your territory is a little bit different because it's a number of countries. And yet ECOWAS is there to support them and help them work with each other. So could you take 3 or 4 minutes and describe how you all are approaching this and thinking about it in ECOWAS?
Okay, thank you very much. I would say I'm glad that ECRI, which stands for ECOWAS Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, is the only sub-regional institution that is working in this collaboration at the moment. All other parties to it are national governments or they are separate countries. ECRI is leading the regional collaboration as per the mandate of the center, which is to promote market penetration of renewable energy and energy efficiency technology in the entire region. So before and following on the Paris Agreement, ECRI has led the region for all the 15 member countries in the region to develop what we call National Renewable Energy Action Plans, Energy Efficiency Action Plans, and then Sustainable Energy for all national agendas, in addition to each country's NDCs that are now in place. So what we intend doing now is to help the individual countries to go through their legal and regulatory support for the implementation of NDCs. So I would say that the leadership compact cannot be in our area or cannot come to us in any opportune time as this time. And we are also we will help the countries to undertake power producers frameworks. For instance, Cape Verde, where the center is based, we are in direct collaboration with them every day because our office is just a minute or two walking from the Ministry of Energy. And we are always talking to them. And we know that they are looking for effective net metering schemes and also trying to promote solar home systems. So with the technical assistance coming through the leadership compact, we believe that all the 15 countries and Cape Verde in particular is going to get the necessary technical assistance that they need. I would say that ECRI, in collaboration with the Clean Energy Solution Center, has put in place solicitation paper that is going to go out online immediately we leave here after the lunch. We will just send message back home that, look, it's time, just put the thing online. And just before we break for Christmas or immediately after Christmas, we begin to receive countries' requests. And in collaboration with the Clean Energy Solution Center, we form a team of reviewers of the requests that will come through. Then we'll see where to take it and how to take it from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Very helpful, and it seems you guys have been very busy. So I want to immediately turn to all of you because I'm sure you have a lot of specific questions that you may or may want to ask. So I'll give you a minute or two to think about them, and then we'll take them in batches. And just while you're thinking, let me ask our panelists this, and we'll start from John and pass the mic down, is I'm sure you've had many lessons learned as you've been working, but just as to get this going, just pick one thing where maybe the way you started, you learned something and you made an adjustment, or this was a big lesson that helped you, this was a thing that helped you move forward in a successful way. Tell us something each of something you learned along the way about how to do this.
Thank you once again. As I told you, because of our role as a regional coordinating agency, we see a lot, we hear a lot, and we learn a lot. And what we have realized is that every country has their main priority and focus. And what we try to do is to allow them their freedom to come out and tell us, look, this is what we need immediately, and we see how best we will help them with technical advice and other support. So I would say we are always working from bottom up, asking them, what do you want? They're telling us what they want, then we help them from that angle.
Thank you, John. Harun, what would be one thing you've learned?
Yes.
It's on. It's on.
The point is, when we were coming up with our act, one of the key issues that we realized is the element of public participation. All the way from the national level to the counties. We had very strong meetings with, especially at the county levels. We moved all over the country, and we got this kind of quite varied kind of opinion from the county level members, and which was able to help us to come up with an act that is very comprehensive in terms of capturing the needs of different groups, especially the marginalized groups, whereby you realize we have about 24 counties that are in the arid and semi-arid areas. Their interests are very, very well captured in terms of prioritizing the needs of the marginal groups. What do I mean? In terms of, for example, constituting the members of the highest decision-making organ, that is the National Climate Change Council. Out of that process, we have representation of the private sector, we have representation of the academia, we have representation of the marginalized groups, especially the indigenous groups. So it's out of that process of public participation that we have been able to capture the interest of the groups that could have not been visible within the Act. And that is very important, and it empowers, especially when we're implementing our NDCs, because we realize that implementation will actually be done by these entities. And if they are not captured, it will be very hard to convince them that whatever we are doing is actually affecting their livelihoods. So we'll be supporting aspects that affect their day-to-day life.
Thank you, Harun. Andrea.
Thank you. So I don't know how it works in most countries, but what we did in Colombia was first we took and we built capacity in our climate change division in the Ministry of Environment. And the way we did that was taking professionals from each sectorial branch that we have in Colombia, so a mechanical engineer that knew about transport and you know, so on and so forth with each of the sectors, and taught them climate change. And then we got really a richness of knowledge of these people from the sectors that knew how they clicked, knew how they worked, what could be sold to them, what was just out of the question in our sectors. That helped a lot. And then we expanded that model beyond, and with help from you guys as well. And we tried to embed a person in each ministry that was from their sector and knew or learned about climate change and worked in only that, because we saw that one of the biggest barriers was that we didn't have a person concentrating on climate change in each ministerial sector. And that was a huge problem, because we had one person doing everything related to environment, couldn't dedicate time to identifying all these actions I talked about before and moving the agenda forward. And once we unlocked that, it really, really helped. Now we have our own national capacity at least one person per ministry. And I think that's a start of unlocking a lot of movement.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting model where instead of trying to teach climate change people transport, agriculture, waste recycling, EU found it easier to teach the specialists in those sectors about climate change. So let's take batches of questions. You know the usual etiquette. Please introduce yourself with your name and organization and keep it to a question, no speeches. And we'll take 2 or 3 at a time, and I'll invite the panelists to pick and choose and speak to what they want to. So.
Good evening, everybody. First of all, I represent the government of Morocco. I would like to present apologies from our minister, Hakim Al-Haiti, for not being able to come because she's stuck in one meeting right now. So first of all, I would like to transmit to you the full support of the government of Morocco in terms of this extremely important initiative of the NDC Leaders Compact. That's one thing. Second, I would like to just to say that in terms of NDC preparation, since it is one of the most important thing and legally binding item in the Paris Agreement, Morocco has been tackling these NDCs in a way where we presented on the 21st of September, while we were ratifying the agreement in New York, we presented an NDC that includes 2 parts. One part which is mitigation and the second part adaptation. And I guess that over 80% of the presented NDCs include one part of adaptation too, most of the African countries. So in our NDCs, we have an objective of mitigating by 42% our greenhouse gas emissions from now to 2030, but 70% are mitigation that will be performed with our own funding. That includes a great effort in terms of energy consumption, energy efficiency. As it has already been mentioned, there is an ambitious program, Moroccan program for solar energy, wind energy, and hydroelectric energy. So we are having as an objective to reach 50% of renewable energies by 2030. So that has been announced last year in Paris by our king. And the 70%, as I said, is with our own means, but we have a conditional part that needs some international funding. The overall funding for our NDC is around $50 billion from now to 2030. The adaptation part is also very important for us, and we had a needs assessment that has been done. And by the way, the NDCs that has been presented until now are very, very important tool for the funders, because it's a great needs assessment that is on the way there, and that can be used by the Green Fund and all the other facilities. So what I would like just to say, and I will finish with that, is that the NDCs is not one size fits all. So each country has its own priorities, as I have heard already. So your initiative and this US initiative is very important because it will help those countries to identify better their needs and to try to move toward some sort of better identification, but better identification of needs in terms of funding. So I think it can play a very good role in this regard. In Morocco, we have just launched a few hours ago in the Moroccan pavilion the 4C initiative that is a network of 7 or 8 different networks around the world in each climate initiatives that will help build capacity for countries, especially countries from Africa and developing countries in the field of climate change, to help them construct or establish their NDCs, and also to help them prepare projects that are able to be funded by international funding.
Fantastic. I mean,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thank you
We're
so much.
very grateful,
Thank you.
of course, to Morocco for hosting this and for participating for participating in this. So thank you very much. I know we have some other questions, and Ashley will get the mic to you.
Hello, my name is Laura Hesse Fisher. I'm from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, working on a project to help countries do very wide-scale stakeholder engagement to support their climate action plans. But my question is about how you are, within your governments, how you're distributing the responsibility of implementing the NDCs within your different government departments. You alluded a little bit to an interinstitutional council, but I'm wondering if you can expand upon that. Thank you.
Okay. We have another one behind you, Ashley, a couple rows.
I realized from Wilberforce is my name. I realized that from ECOWAS and even in Kenya, those countries have 5-year development plans and visions, and yet the delegate from Kenya was saying they are working on a climate change development plan and an act. Are you abandoning any of the visions you had? Didn't you have these mainstreamed? Because by definition, I think climate change is a cross-cutting issue. If you are coming by an act, are you doing away with the Land Use Act and other acts related to various sectors for agriculture? I want to be educated on this.
Thank you.
Delegate from Uganda.
And let's have one more if we've got. Otherwise, we'll run with those two first. Okay, so while we're thinking of other questions, we've got the general question asking for a little more detail about the allocation of responsibilities. And maybe, John, if you know if you have any information from some of your member countries, you could also speak to that. And then Haroon, some specific questions about the legislation and how it intersects with the others. So Andrea's got the mic closest to her, so we'll start with her.
Thank you. And thank you for the questions. Yes, it's a difficult thing. You come back home, and of course the commitment was made by all of us, but you start the implementation phase. In our case, you started amidst a very big change in our economy, not for the best, a very difficult change with oil prices going down and the national budget going down. And there is that question to the ministers. So now how do we divide this? To start, you all have your plans. And ministers are also people, so they start to try to negotiate through that. So we presented different options to them. And one option was, they were based on different analysis, and one option was just 20%, everybody delivers 20% reduction on their own baseline, which equates, of course, to the 20% reduction nationally. And that seemed to be the easiest thing to agree amongst ministries because it responds to their emissions and, of course, how they can reduce those emissions and kind of compete with themselves and with their baseline. So that was what was agreed, and then we agreed to do also some cost analysis to see with that number how much it would cost each ministry. And now what they're doing is looking towards that, adding up what they have in the mitigation action plans through this filter of what is possible and what maybe was a little bit more ambitious than what the current economy can withstand, and where that percentage is now. And we have some that at the beginning said, well, I can only do 3%, and now they're going up to 7%, and they're slowly kind of adding in as they get more information and they refine their analysis. They're getting closer and closer to that 20%. So we did this 20% overall, and then they're all growing from the bottom up, and that was a very important point, is going from the bottom up is critically important when you get into implementation to make sure that you have something feasible.
Haroon.
Thank you very much for the two questions. Let me first of all start with the question of responsibilities in implementing our NDC. We are taking a sectoral approach whereby as a country we have identified 5 priorities, that is waste, forestry, agriculture, transport, and energy. Those are our sectors that we are working with. So what we have done at first is we are doing the deepening, understanding analysis of what our 30% emission reduction mean for each of those sectors. Then we are moving forward to get budget implications for each of the sector when it comes to the implementation. vis-a-vis the priority actions per each of the sector. So in principle, that's what we are doing. And then within that sector, we have done institutional mapping, whereby we have got lead or champion institutions that will be spearheading implementation of our priority actions we need within each of that sector. Hope that is clear. Then the question about us abandoning our our other policy documents. Definitely in Kenya we do the 5 medium-term planning, and actually we're in the last cycle of our current medium-term plan. In fact, our act is providing the coordination framework. In fact, it refers all other related acts and actually the constitutional requirement. So it provides the coordination framework, and then, I mean the coordination aspect, and then we have got actually the policy framework that brings together actually our vision as a country in terms of how we are going to address the climate change vis-a-vis all other policies. So in any way, it does not contradict all the existing policies, and we don't negate in terms of taking it as a priority act, such that we might compromise the ones that are existing. In fact, it strengthens all other policies, and they are well documented within the initial schedules of the act. Thank you.
John?
Thank you very much. I will try to answer the second question on allocation of responsibilities. In the ECOWAS region, what information getting to us from our day-to-day collaboration is that many of the countries are undertaking what we call interministerial coordination and collaboration when it comes to climate change issues because of the cross-cutting nature of it. Myself and some of my colleagues were in Ghana a couple of weeks ago, and I had some discussion with the Minister for Environment, and he was telling me that, look, we are making sure that every sector plays certain role. For example, the Ministry for Local Government are in charge of sanitation in the cities, and they have their role to play. Ministry of Transport has got its own role to play because of the numerous cases. So all that he was trying to tell me is there's a sort of interministerial collaboration that they meet, decide on what to do, then from there each ministry goes up with its own activities and actions. But at the end of the day, they try to come back as a team again and see the way forward. How are we making progress? This thing is also happening in Gambia. I was in Gambia at the beginning of September, and one of my colleagues was telling me that their interministerial meeting is taking them to a longer distant places because the ministries are dispersed, and sometimes too looks like they don't know who is the top, another thing. So there are clear-cut challenges in there, but in summary, I would say that there is this interministerial collaboration among within different countries that are trying to see how best they can come out with a way forward when it comes to climate change issues. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So we've got about 10 minutes left. So if we have a few other questions, we can do one more round. So if we have questions, raise your hand, please. There's one there. And okay. Yeah.
Hello, my name is René Estermann from My Climate Foundation, Switzerland. I have a question about the carbon markets and the NDCs. How do you guarantee for the carbon markets eventual mitigation activities that they are additional to your NDCs, that they are transferable to the countries? We have now from the airline industry a global agreement where we need a lot of carbon emission reductions to CORSIA. Switzerland as a country previews in his NDC international engagements, formerly the CDM. So how do you differentiate carbon market activities, mitigation activities, and NDC activities?
Hi, Ron Benioff with the National Renewable Energy Lab in the U.S. And first, congratulations for really the tremendous work that you're doing and Morocco and other countries are doing, setting the pathway that is inspiring all of us and that we can learn from. My question has to do with the private sector and the mechanisms that you have found to be most effective for engaging the private sector, not only in the policies that you're developing, but how you can crowd in private capital and mobilize investment as an ultimate source of financing to achieve your NDC goals, and what can we learn from your approaches there? Thank you.
Okay, so we've got two complex questions, and I'd invite all three of you to each take a stab at whichever portion you'd like. And since the mic's sitting next to you, Harun, why don't you start this time, if you don't mind?
And I would challenge our panelists to be very brief because we have just 5 minutes total left for the event.
Thank you very much, Shelly. This is an issue, especially for the carbon market, because of double accounting, because we know that, for example, the countries that are offsetting our carbon, for example, in the energy sector, they might be reporting that in the NDC, being a developed country. So it's an issue we are grumbling, but where we are very clear, for example, is our numbers, because these are directly being implemented in our country. But for the carbon market, still grumbling, that is an issue that is still under discussion, especially for the energy sector. It has been raised, but you have not actually very much resolved about it. Then there's the issue of mechanism of engaging the private sector. In Kenya, actually, and this is in line with what support we are getting from the EC-LEDs, from the US government, which we do really appreciate, is that we are coming up with a process of strategic engagement of the private sector, where we would like to see, for example, like coming up with strategic CSR, where they can be able to tap the CSR initiatives by the private sector. So we just want to look for innovative mechanisms, even crowdfunding. So we are looking at different pathways that can be followed by the private sector that will have a double sword kind of gain, whereby they are going to gain in terms of maybe tax reductions, like what is happening in India. We want to borrow like the model of India. It's very successful, where they get tax exemption from the money that they take to strategic CSR, also in line maybe from the SDGs. You can also target the SDGs so that they can be able to identify areas they can support.
Thank you, Harun. John?
Thank you once again. I think I'll also talk about the private sector, because NDCs and carbon markets, we are not at the moment as a regional institution into it. But when it comes to private sector, though our mandate asks us to work with various governments in the region, we have a facility called ECOWAS Renewable Energy Facility that allows us to engage directly with the private sector. But what we do is we make sure that when we float the facility out there, applications come for specific renewable energy and energy efficiency projects. So we set our own guidelines such that those that will qualify for that facility are working within the parameters of renewable energy and energy efficiency. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Andrea last to either of those questions.
Thank you. To the private sector one, which for me is the most difficult one, I want to point out first that there's some previous steps that you have to take to engage private sector. To be able to capture them, engage them, and make them part of the action, you have to have things very detailed. You have to know what they cost, how they will work, the scope of them, everything. And in many cases, we have actions that are identified, but not to that detail. Even that takes a lot of money and time. So we're getting into that stage. That's a part where international help, technical and otherwise, can help a lot, because you do have to build all that before they come. So that's the first thing. And then it varies very much by sector. Private sector looks very different in agriculture, where there's like association of producers, or where there's companies and industries in the industrial sector. So it varies, and you need to prepare those mechanisms for them, and those are where some of the barriers I was talking about. In some public-private partnership, for example, can make sense, and we have laws that facilitate those, but they're not thought for climate change, so they need to be adjusted and adapted to serve climate change purposes. And others, we are working with them very well, with producer associations, for example. But the point I wanted to make in this is you need to get very, very specific for the private sector to be able to be involved. And in a lot of areas where we just don't have that level of detail, and that's where we're going and where we need help.
Thank you, Andrea. So to wrap up, first of all, I'd like to thank all of you for coming and joining in this discussion. I'm sure we could have gone a lot longer. I hope everybody has learned at least one or two things from each of the panelists and what their countries are doing, because you see the richness of it and how there's so much tailoring that's necessary. And I know I've learned from each one of you. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panelists both for their doing this, but for their work in their countries. So if you want further discussion, they'll be here, but you will see that people are going to be moving chairs out and everything in order to get ready for the next event.